It's really great to see you all here. So today, what I have planned is I am going to 소리가 So I don't know how much everyone here knows about Korea, but Korea has been going through some major changes. And I think one of the things that makes Korea really unique is the fact that it's the government that is pushing MyData or human centricity in Korea. And one of the agencies that is actively trying to facilitate and establish a MyData ecosystem in Korea is the Korea Data Agency. And so today I want to give a brief introduction. Well, I want to let Korea Data Agency introduce themselves, and then we'll give a 5-minute talk about how MyData has evolved in Korea over the last 3 years. And then we will we'll talk about the 4 main branches of government that are each kind of doing their own MyData initiatives and how they intend to bring it all together. And then we'll give another 5-minute brief introduction about what the MyData team at Korea Data Agency does. And so the way I want to take this conversation into the discussion of how to align national initiatives across borders is by first presenting the challenges that Korea is facing. And from what I've gathered in my discussions with some experts recently, the issues that we have are in some ways different, but at the same time, they are very similar too, which makes it really interesting, I think. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes at most getting an introduction about Korea. And then after that, we will be talking with people or experts from the EU, from the US, and from Korea about what the differences are and how we might be able to work together to come to a mutually beneficial collaboration. Okay, any questions? All right then. So the first, oh, and by the way, please forgive me for, well, we made recordings because we wanted to make sure that the delivery was as good as possible. So what we'll be
Greetings from Korea.
Sorry. What I'll be doing is I'll be showing some videos, and the first video is going to be by the director of the MyData team at the Korea Data Agency.
Greetings from Korea. Let's begin with a brief introduction about our agency. We are called the Korea Data Agency, or KData, and we've been around since 1993. We are a part of the Science and Ict branch within Korea's government structure. At the highest level, KData has 4 activities: global business support, domestic data industry support, data certification, and human resources development. I'm the director of the MyData program, which you see circled here. Our work has been focused on facilitating a fair, transparent, and prosperous personal data industry in Korea. Even though we are focused on domestic activities, I believe we must make sure that Korea's personal data ecosystem is interoperable with that of other countries. We are living in a digital society where borders are becoming increasingly meaningless, and I look forward to finding out how K-data can foster an international collaboration in the MyData context. Before moving on, I'd like to direct your attention to some of our cross-border activities. In terms of exporting domestic products, we are always looking for domestic companies that have the potential for making a global impact, and our budget allows for supporting their efforts financially and relationship-wise. This means it is important for us to understand global trends so that we know how to identify Korean companies that are aligned with the principles of foreign frameworks. This is why we have been emphasizing the MyData principles in our selection of personal data consortiums to fund. Each year, we participate in global exhibitions and conferences, and we also organize events domestically. Just last month, we were delighted to have Timu, Bievre, Julian, and Yogi share with us the viewpoint of MyData Global regarding policy, business strategy, and interoperability. As the director of K-Data's MyData effort, I look forward to continuing to strengthen the relationship between MyData Global and Korea. Here, you are going to see a 2-minute video showing how K-Data has facilitated developing a MyData ecosystem in Korea. It begins with Timu speaking in Seoul at our MyData conference of 2019. Following the video playback, Eunjin Koo, my colleague, will take the stage and speak to you about the role of the Korean government in relation to MyData.
Right. So I think before we go to the video, I want to point out that that the Korea Data Agency and the director of the MyData team, who's here in the audience right now, by the way, he emphasizes the MyData principles and how he feels that it is the way for Korea to collaborate internationally, especially regarding MyData. So one thing that I would like to point out is that that we are very principle driven and that we love the idea of the MyData principles. Now, the next video is a 2-minute video, and it's an introduction of what the Korea Data Agency has done. They have funded $10 million last year into 8 consortiums, 8 pilot projects, and these 8 pilot projects are what you'll be seeing, and you'll get to see what has been built.
Later on, my friend.
Sorry, I keep doing that.
Later on, my friends, of course, we will get down to practical use cases. So the topic today,
This is Temu
for me,
last
is
year
talking about the MyData model.
in Korea.
정부는 국민의 개인 데이터를 안전하게 활용할 수 있는 생태계를 조성하여 사람이 중심이 되는 마이데이터 지원 사업을 추진하고 있습니다. 금융, 의료, 학술, 유통, 에너지 등 국민 생활에 밀접한 분야의 마이데이터 실증 서비스 8개 과제를 발굴 지원합니다. 긴급 상황 시 응급 환자의 일상생활 데이터와 건강 기록을 의사에게 제공하여 정밀 진료를 가능하게 하고, 상대적으로 신용 정보가 빈약한 대학생, 사회초년생, 주부, 은퇴자의 금융 정보, 비금융 정보를 활용해 금융 취약계층에게도 딱 맞는 금융 생활을 제공하고 있습니다. 외근, 출장이 많은 개인 사업자를 위한 간편 사업 정보 서비스도 이용할 수 있습니다. 사업에 필요한 대출 상품도 추천받고 정부 지원 사업도 매칭해주죠. 꼼꼼히 따져볼 수 없었던 우리 집 난방비도 이제 직접 관리해볼 수 있게 됩니다. 사용량 분석뿐만 아니라 비교 분석을 통해 이상 징후를 조기 파악하는 등 마이데이터로 다양한 경험을 즐기고 있습니다. 뿐만 아니라 다양한 대국민 행사를 개최하여 혁신적인 아이디어를 발굴하고 본인 정보 자기결정권에 대한 인식을 확산하고 있습니다. 개인 데이터의 안전한 활용을 통해 개인정보 자기결정권 강화와 데이터 경제 혁신을 성장 견인하겠습니다. 마이데이터.
Okay, so that is what happened in 2019. And just to give you a quick overview, there were 3 healthcare pilot projects, 2 commerce, and 1 finance, 1, well, there were 2 more, right? But the energy consumption, and as well, academia, that's right, skills data. And each of these, the way that these projects were selected was it was based on how much benefit the service would bring to the individual, right? So that's one of the most important criterias that Korea Data Agency, as a government agency with funding, is looking for. And last year, the idea of a MyData operator was not as important as the service being innovative. And that's kind of what we saw. But then I think one of the issues that we had that I'll want to bring up in the discussion later was that, for instance, with healthcare, we had 3 different healthcare consortiums, and they were each using their own blockchains. Now, you'd think that they would want to work together and have their services be interoperable. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And one of the biggest issues was the fact that they didn't have a common data standard. They were each using their own data models. They were willing to find a common ground, but none of them was willing to step up and be the one to lead. And so that's kind of one of the issues that I think we'll want to talk about in the discussions. Are there any questions? If there are, if you put them in the chat, I'm also checking the chat. So by all means, please do. Now, I said earlier that the unique thing about Korea is that it's the government that is pushing the MyData agenda. It's not the people, and it's not the companies. It's the government saying that these companies need to be human-centric in order to treat the people right. And I think that's a very powerful and in a way forceful sort of a drive for MyData. And the next person who will be speaking is going to show you the timeline of how MyData has evolved. And I believe, if I'm correct, I think it was 2014 when the MyData white paper first came out. And you'll see that in Korea, MyData started in 2017. I will just go straight to playing the video now. I'm sorry. Before I do that, let me share some stuff in the chat. I have a script that you could read as you watch. I think it might help. So this script here is on Google Docs, and let me also share the video files. There you go. Okay.
My name is Eunjin-gu, and as a member of the MyData team at K-Data, I'm delighted that I'm able to say Korea today is undergoing major shift in key industry in the direction of human centricity. Several laws are being revised, a brand new regulated industry has been born, and the amount of interest in MyData in Korea has grown to a point where it is a term that most of the general public recognize. This didn't happen overnight though. Here you are seeing a timeline of MyData related government policies and initiative on the top and the search result for MyData in Korea on Google Trend. It's clear how MyData started in 2017 and has continued to gain momentum. This first bump on the far left is probably due to one of our projects here at K-Data, when we conducted a research project about simulation of MyData system design. It can be said that K-Data was the first driver of MyData movement in Korea. The next one to write is related to the Financial Service Commission when they announced that they will be developing and regulating a new business within the context of finance. They decided to name in the MyData industry, specializing in financial personal data. Toward the end of 2018, amendments to 3 data-related laws were proposed in the name of human-centricity. This is when the government officially decided to step in and drive the entire data industry toward giving individuals control over their own data. At this point, we had the support to start funding pilot project in May 2019. We selected 8 consortium in 5 major sectors and funded a total of around 10 million US dollars. What we just saw in the video are the apps that were developed by this pilot project. In the first quarter of 2019, a national plan is fostering innovation by digitalizing government service was established, and we were expecting to see the launch of a MyData portal by the end of the next month. Much like Estonia, Korea is also progressing toward being able to provide all public service digitally. The MyData principles are embedded in this development, and Korean citizens will be able to control their government health data and use it in a substantially more convenient way. Following our pilot funding in 2019, we selected another 9 consortiums this year for proof of concept purpose. One thing to note is that we made a major change in the requirement for funding in 2020. Now this spike here at the far right happened when we new data laws were enforced and the Financial Service Commission began accepting applications from business interested in processing financial personal data as a licensed MyData entities. Right now we are at a point where the private and public sector are independently pursuing MyData agendas and developing in infrastructure needed to support the MyData principle. In 2021, our citizens will have the tools to put their data to use under their own terms and for their own purpose. I will pass the ball to Snow now.
Great. Thank you for the question and the comments in the chat. So let me use this here to explain. So in Korea, the idea of MyData started in 2017. And I mean, it's pretty clear. I think I don't see any other way it could have happened if it without having been influenced by MyData Global. And the funny thing is that the Ministry of Science and ICT, the Financial Services Commission, the Ministry of the Interior and Safety, and also the Ministry of Health and Welfare, they are all preaching human centricity. And the way that they're doing it is very highly aligned with the MyData principles. They don't explicitly mention the principles, but when you look closely, you'll see that every single principle is there except for one of them. And I guess I'm kind of assuming that everyone knows what the principles are. If not, you can go to mydata.org/declaration, chapter 3. And the one principle that is somewhat, I guess, difficult for the government to enforce is the interoperability principle. Instead of interoperability, the way that they, the word that they use is reciprocity. Right? So if you give or you take, then you give. That's kind of the way that it's described. Now, there was a question, thank you, Matthias, about what kind of changes in the law that there were. Now, that's a very long answer. There's a long answer to that, but the reason why is because, so there has been changes in the Personal Information Protection Act. Along with that, there has been changes in the Credit Information Protection Act. And the Credit Information Protection Act is basically the Financial Information Protection Act. It's not just about how much credit I have, it's about all of my finances. Now, on top of that, there are changes in the Medicare law. I don't know how to say it in English, but it's the law that has to do with healthcare, with doctors. And so that's also changing. And then we have the digital government laws changing as well. And the way or the direction in which all of these laws are changing is just, they're all saying that personal data belongs to the citizens. And I think out of them all, the one that has been most impactful this year is the Credit Information Protection Law revision. And the next speaker will be explaining what those major changes were. But to give you an idea, in Korea, there's no data portability protection, except now for financial personal data. And the financial personal data, that sector is regulated by the Financial Services Commission. And so all of the banks, all of the insurance companies, like anything finance related, like they need to listen to the Financial Services Commission. And these banks have been very, very, what's the word? They haven't been happy and they've been trying to push back, but the Financial Services Commission is very adamant about making human centricity protected by law. And that's, I think, a wonderful thing. Um, there's some a debate about whether or not they did it the right way, but I think at the very least they made a stance. They took a stance, and I think it was the right one. And so I personally have a lot of hope for how things will change because it's just the first of what will be a series of changes, I believe. Uh, in terms of the other acts, so uh, Unjin Ku just mentioned that there were 3 acts that were changed. And those 3 are actually the Personal Information Protection Act, uh, the Credit Information Protection Act, and the Network and Communications Act. Now, the reason why these 3 were changed together is because they're all related to data. So in Korea, they actually call it the 3 data laws. Um, Data portability was put into the financial information legislature. However, in the Personal Information Protection Act, there's still no clause for data portability. What there is, though, is a very clear um, description about how consent should be, uh, how a company needs to get the consent, that it needs to be easy to understand, well informed, what sorts of information needs to be in the consent, and also there is the clause of having to explain or being accountable to explain your decisions as a company. And the third one, the Network and Communications Act, the reason why that one is in there is because there were clauses in that act, in the Network and Communications Act, that got deleted. Right? So those clauses got deleted and they got put into the Personal Information Protection Act and the Credit Information Protection Act. The second huge change that we have seen right now is the Financial Services Commission. They created an entirely new industry, and they're calling it the MyData industry. Literally, the MyData industry, like one word, MyData. And they actually at one point they tried to make it illegal for anyone that isn't certified to use the word MyData. And um, us being a part of the MyData Korea Hub, like we actually like put in a complaint and changed that law. So if you're in finance and you have the word MyData in your title, then it is then you need to be certified. Sorry, okay, so yeah, I'm getting a question about where do the regulations touch or consider cross-border issues. So cross-border here, I think if you mean across international borders, it's not quite clear. One of the issues that I think is that we need to solve in Korea is that the society seems somewhat closed, right? A lot of the times when I talk about the MyData principles, I'll often hear that it doesn't apply to Korea. And when I hear that, I tell them that that's not true. That in fact, in the law, all of the principles are there. It's just not explicit. It's embedded in the law. Um, but in terms of a cross-border legislation, I don't know of anything off the top of my head. Maybe if I think of something, or if anyone else has anything that they want to share, then please, by all means. Um, so okay, so that being said, I think the next video, and I guess our time goes by so fast. The next video is going to be about the 4 government branches that are actually pushing forth the human centricity in Korea. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, I'm Soonho, and I'll be showing you the approach of the Korean government in driving MyData. At the top level, the goal is to put the individual at the very center regarding the use of their personal data. In particular, there are 4 government branches under the Prime Minister of Korea that have been tasked with promoting MyData principles within their respective industry. I quickly go over each of them and point out some of their key features. The Ministry of Science and Ict is in charge of facilitating the development of MyData ecosystem. What you are seeing here is basic architecture of our funded consortium and their pilot projects. Our approach is based on the MyData operator reference model and its 9 functionalities. On the right, you can see I have grayed out data model management and governance. This is because we have found them to be tricky to make requirements, so we have to settle for just strongly recommending this practice. Hopefully, our panel discussion today will help us find feasible ways to encourage business to adopt common standard and governance framework. The finance sector is regulated by Financial Service Commission. They have taken the lead by pushing forward with the revisions in legislature and creating new MyData business license. They somewhat force the banks of Korea to loosen their grip on the handling of citizen data. One of the ways they have done this is by legally protecting people's rights to data portability. As of right now, data portability rights exist only in the context of financial personal data. Of course, we'd like to have data portability rights for all types of personal data eventually, but still, this is a good start. Another way the FSC is promoting MyData is by licensing business that want to offer individual service that integrate their financial data. Basically, any company that has access to person's financial data in its entirety must first be certified by FSC and conformed to their rules. We have had around 60 companies apply for this license. In the first round, 35 of them passed, and just a few days ago, 6 of them were disqualified due to conflict of interest. Healthcare sector is another highly regulated sector where the way of the MyData is expected to have significant impact on the people's quality of life. The Ministry of Health and Welfare is leading here, and they are making steadfast progress to putting healthcare data in hands of the individual. Their approach is to build the central hub or gateway for consolidating and sharing personal healthcare data. Their project, My Healthway, is expected to start being developed in 2021. As Eunjin mentioned, National Strategy for Government Digitalization and Public Service Innovation is ongoing, and Ministry of the Interior and Safety is in charge of this. In April this year, they have started developing a portal named the MyData portal for public service. The portal is expected to begin operating next month in January 2021. Here you can see the Korean government's vision for bringing together the separated efforts of government branches. The near-term goal is to get going with each sector and to bring them together all of the data generated from single point of control. Next, Mili will show you the specifics of what our team is doing to ensure Korean is able to develop a personal data ecosystem MyData way.
Right. So what you just saw here is these four ministries are leading. Well, they've been given orders from the Prime Minister of Korea to drive human centricity in Korea. And they each have hold of a different type of sector. The financial sector is highly regulated, and it has its own financial services commission. The healthcare sector is led by the Ministry of Health and Welfare, and the public services sector is the Ministry of the Interior and Safety. And the Ministry of Interior and Safety is essentially the ministry that deals with social security numbers and anything that has to do with public services. And the private sector is kind of a broad term, and that doesn't mean that the private sector initiatives does not have anything to do with finance or healthcare. Actually, they do, but the point of the private sector is to bring business models into the picture. It's not just going to be about regulation. It has to be about creating value, and that is the focus of the Korea Data Agency. The one that has been moving the fastest is the finance industry, like you've just seen. And right behind them is the Ministry of the Interior and Safety. Now, the Ministry of the Interior and Safety, here, this is the architecture of their system for handling personal data. I just want to point out a few things here. Like some of you who are familiar with DIDs, SSI, will notice that these are issuers, verifiers, credentials, right? So, and there's a reason for this. Like the Ministry of Interior and Safety is actually um, looking into DIDs or DIDs as a potential technology for handling citizen identity. It's not mainstream yet, but they have at least two initiatives in place right now. One of them has to do with driver's license, and the other one has to do with their own employees at the Ministry of the Interior and Safety. So they're kind of testing out the technology on their own selves first. They're being their own guinea pigs of their experiment. Um, Now, the Ministry of Health of the Interior and Safety has they came out with a digital wallet last year for all citizens to use. So any citizen, if you have a cell phone, then you have a digital wallet through which you can request for government certified documentation. You can also use it to submit your information to these government or public agencies. Um, it's and in a way, it's kind of like everyone has sort of a way to use their personal data. And then this year, what the agenda was for the Ministry of Interior and Safety was to create a place where people would be able to not just have a wallet, but actually to use it in more various ways. And so they started building this portal, which you see here on the right. And the portal is basically it's the way into an area where all the public or all the connected public agencies are there. So it's somewhere where you can go to collect your data. You can actually mix and match your data. And they also have a personal data store for every single person. Um, the personal data store is not entirely storage, right? So the way that they use it is they they offer everyone a place to save URLs to their documents. But still, it's a government operated facility, and uh, it's open to use if you have innovative services that you could propose to the government, and in that case, then you would actually not even need to pay for the infrastructure for these PDSs. Um, and then you can see here on the right, I think this right here, the API gateway, this is largely similar to what they've done in Estonia with X-Road, I think. And the the direction of the Ministry of Interior and Safety seems to be going in the way that Estonia has gone, which and Estonia is a great example, I think. Um, Now, we already kind of mentioned, I already kind of mentioned the financial services, so I won't go into this too more deeply, but I do think it's important to note that there were disqualifications, right? So, uh, and I think that shows that the Financial Services Commission is not they don't really care about who makes money. What they really care about is making sure that there's no conflict of interest, and that the people who get to use or who get to consolidate these the personal data of an individual would have enough reason and enough fear to use it in a responsible, ethical way. And I really like this about the Financial Services Commission. I think it's they're about principles, um, and uh, and yeah. Uh, One of the things that you need to do in order to get a license is you need to have your architecture needs to be separated. Uh, um, if you're a bank, then you can't mix in your new MyData business operations with your original banking operations. It needs to be um, uh, uh, they need to be on different networks, and that I think is how I want to segue into a discussion, perhaps towards different types of security architectures, such as a zero trust architecture. And and here, lastly, this is the Ministry of Science and ICT. This is actually the KData, the way the KData has structured their architecture. And the thing that I want to point out here is that it's absolutely um, similar to the MyData operator model. The one thing that is slightly different is that in the MyData operator reference model, it said the white paper says that personal data storage or personal data stores is not a necessary component. However, in Korea, and I think maybe even in Japan, there is a lot of hype in a way over personal data stores. Um, I've even heard people say that the only way to make money as a MyData operator would be to operate a personal data store. And I we have some panelists today um, that have some really good insight into that. So we'll be getting into that as well. Okay, I don't want to waste too much more time on this. If you have any questions now or later, please feel free to ask. I'm always happy to talk about this. Sorry, I see something in the chat. Slide 18. Adrian, please do. Uh,
So
Mhm.
thank you. Um, in the opening plenary, we had a presentation from the iSPERT group, which is, you could think of it as a related effort to KData. It's not at all the same thing, of course. It's not a government, it's not directly a government-led thing. As you pointed out, Korea is unusual in that way. But what's important, a big point that they made is that they showed exactly the same diagram that you have on the screen right now. But when the data went from the source to the service, that lower pair of arrows, they made a big point, and they actually labeled on the diagram end-to-end encrypted. In other words, it was a central tenet of their design that the thing that is in the middle as the operator would not see the data at all. And I'm curious, not just from the people in the Korea thing, but also from the people that are representing the MyData principles or MyData Global, as to which of these is the future, let's say, which is, there are lots of reasons that one might do it one way or another as an interim state. But my question is, what is the end state that we want, either in Korea context or the MyData Global context?
I think this would be a great question for Matthias, because I mean, if Matthias, or if you're willing to speak about your
Hi, yes,
thoughts on
thank you,
this, yes.
Chris.
Mhm.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm happy to give my views on it and who I'm representing. I'm not officially right now representing my data as the organization. So, but I'll give my views on this personal data stores. First, I'd like to say that congratulations, Korea, and this has been very, very inspiring. Thank you for inviting me today, because it's really amazing what the government has done and the investments that are going this way, and all the work that has been happening. It's not the same in France. We don't have yet that much government support, so it's really inspiring to see what you have been doing. On the personal data store, my opinion on it is that there is no real need for it, and in the end, no real value for it. And I'm sorry if I'm a bit provocative, but if we look from the person's side, uh, what do people want? They don't want to see their data or store their data. They want to get better healthcare, or they want to find a job, or they want to get a reduction. So it's not that much about the data than the data use. And so it's not about storing the data, it's about the consent and the permission you give on the data. And this is the true control for the person, is this consent and being able to freely manage this permission and consent, no matter where the data is stored. And it can be stored in the healthcare, and you can give a consent for it to go directly to the healthcare application or other service you want to provide on that data. It's also easier to use, because if you have a personal data store, you give a consent from the source to the store, and then from the store to the using service. And this is bad UX in a sense, when you can do it more directly. Also, a more business reason is that in the end, the personal data store does not offer any other value or service to the data source than storing the data somewhere else. And usually what we've seen is that data sources, if you want, aside from dedicated consortiums, but if you want something to scale, data sources do not see the value of saying, okay, we're gonna invest in an infrastructure and technical means for people to store their data elsewhere. And then other people doing things on the data we can't really control, and we don't get direct value out of it. What we see is that data sources will invest in building networks where they remain a little bit in control of what happens in the data under their responsibility, but also where the value, they get direct value out of the data sharing. For instance, if we're working a lot, and I'll get a bit more about why we're saying all that and what we're working on, but we're working a lot on skills data and what you called academia. So allowing people to share their data from universities, employers, training organizations, public services, to get right training recommendation or right job recommendations. We see that in such a network, everybody gets value. The university gets value of the data inside the employer to follow their students, and the employer gets the value out of the data inside the university to certificate a diploma or such. So data sources and data using services will invest in creating such a network if they see and can get direct value out of the data exchange, and not a promise of indirect value in saying, okay, your data will be stored elsewhere, and then you might get access to data that is stored from somebody else in that store. So for these different reasons, I believe that the true MyData way, that is about the individual that wants to get value out of the use of its data and not the storage of this data, and also for services that want to get value out of this data sharing, is more direct data sharing, as Adrian was saying, end-to-end, but from the source to the service, and the individual being able to manage through permissions this data sharing. And so we are working on this from Europe, where the European Commission has just announced its Data Governance Act, with data sharing services that are neutral, independent, and that in the end only allow to manage this direct transfer and nothing else. And we are working with Olivier, that is also in the audience, on skills data projects and mobility projects, and also starting in health projects to build this kind of wide infrastructure.
Thank you. So I think that was great. So if I understand correctly, the main point is that a PDS might take away the value that a data source or a data provider or data source could potentially see, and that might kind of break the ecosystem balance. We have Medjaoui in the audience right now. He's one of the panelists. He has to leave in 5 minutes, and so I'd like to give him the stage for a few minutes before he goes. So Mehdi, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
I also organize conference, and in 20 minutes we have our API Days conference, about the main conference about APIs and portability through APIs. Yes, but I wanted to be sure I could participate, and thank you, Chris, for having me. Again, as Matthias was saying, great work from let's say the Korean government and ministries. Like I'm the co-author of a report on APIs for government in Europe. From the European Commission, and it's really, I'm really glad to see this coming from the Korean government and how you manage it. I just want to share answer to you, Matthias, and we know each other, Matthias. I agree with you. People want just better user experience services, and they don't want personal data stores. Like, we don't want to store our money, we don't want to store our data, right? We have banks to store the money, right? And we accept others to store our data if it's well stored. I totally agree with you. But let's say now there is this negotiation of power that come, and let's say we've seen the last 12 years when we let companies manage their own, let's say a delegation system, or when they manage their own let's say identity from the identity of their users, they begin to accumulate value in a way that that is not sustainable for the whole ecosystem, and even against the interest of the user. We can see many platforms having their sign-in button or stuff like that, managing the flows of the OAuth protocol, the Open Authorization Protocol. And now they become the identity provider, and now they manage the data and the permissions, right? So unless, and again, the MyData operator concept is exactly that, but you need to have the right negotiation of power and negotiation of value, because if at some point, not everybody plays fair, not everybody is as open to manage the consent and the data and everything, right? They will, at some point, they will, it will be not sustainable. Just an example with APIs, right? Because APIs has been so far the best way to share data, between two applications, right? Between two companies. And yes, but it's many companies have decided to cut API access to third parties, even in interest, against the interest of the user, because it was against their own company interest. So this is why I think as a policy maker and as a government, with MyData operators, with in the work you're doing, the concept of API neutrality needs also to be put. For example, in the PSD2 regulation on the financial services in Europe, we have this concept about like the API, the access should be open to anyone who has access to, right? And it's a regulation enforced. Unless you push that idea, right, people will always have the right to decide how much they comply with the fairness of the system and the data sharing, right? And at some point, they will be able to not share everything they should, but just everything they accept to share from the user. So I agree with you about data stores. It's a solution that enables the user to re-own everything, but not, he doesn't want to do that. He accepts the data to be shared as long as he's able to manage the permissions. But we need to be sure the company accept to play fair about the permissions. And in my opinion, the only way to do that is to go forward and push for API access neutrality, in a sense that, yeah, all the data of a user can be managed and the permissions can be granted to a third party without possibility for the data owner, the data store, right, to avoid it. Yeah.
Mehdi, I know you have to go in a few minutes, so I just want to make sure that I understand correctly. So the key term that you mentioned right now is API neutrality. And the way I understood it, as you were saying it right now, is API neutrality is about making sure that the individual is the one that's in control of the data, even if it's through an API and the data exists somewhere else. Is that correct?
No. Yeah. Now you can hear me. For example, in GDPR regulations, it's mostly about the data in a file or whatever, and not direct API access that developer love, and actually that makes really the portability real, right? When you have to wait 30 days for data, which is in different format, like it's really hard. But now, so API is really the way to transfer the data in a way that is digital and that works, right? So this is why the API is really the key. But for example, 2 senators in the US tried to pass a bill about this API neutrality idea, where actually, when you ask the data to be shared from a service to another, you have the party receiving the data will have a full API access from the first provider for a period of 3 months, right? Without the possibility of the company to restrict access to the what the APIs provide, right? So this bill didn't pass yet, right? But yeah, this is the idea that because the data will transfer through API, and because company most of the time restrict the API access to a third party to keep control, unless your push for API neutrality is that the same level of access to the same API for everybody, right? Who is connecting with personal data to a company, right? You will always let, unless you have this API neutrality, you will always let discretion for the identity providing company, right? The first data, the first company storing the data from the user, you will always let this company a choice about what they can share for portability, right? If you push for full API neutrality, say every time you share an API access to someone, right, with user data, you will have to share the same level of access to anyone the user decides to, and you cannot restrict this level of access. So this is the idea of API neutrality, and like this, right, we have I think we solved the last step that Matthias is doing about like being sure we don't have to store the data in personal data stores. Everybody can store some pieces of data. We just manage permissions, but these permissions will be to the same level of quality of access from anybody of the network, as long as the user grants it and with the user consent.
Wow, that's great. I didn't know there was a term for that, but I absolutely agree with the idea of API neutrality. Mehdi, I know you have to go. Thank you so much for coming by. I really appreciate it. And guys, there's API days going on as well. As along with this, it's free. So if you're interested in API days, and I think that's a great place to go to.
I'm part of MyData. I didn't want to compete, with MyData. It's just a calendar collision. Yes, but for next events, for if you're interested about how data portability through APIs and API, the mindset for governments or companies, there is another great conference called API Days. But I think MyData is for people talking about data and personal data is the conference to be, and I was really glad to be there. Thank you, Chris.
Great,
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mehdi. Talk to you soon.
Chris, can I take a minute?
Yes, please.
On this, because of course I agree with Mehdi, and I'd like to maybe illustrate how it's exactly this is happening in Europe. So the European Commission just announced their Data Governance Act, where they quote the separation between the people that provide the data, the organizations that provide the data, of course, the organizations that use the data, and the organizations that are the intermediaries. And for personal data, this what they call data sharing services, and what we among us call MyData operators, are independent and neutral and are mandatory in a data exchange. So what that means in practice is that in the end, people have a robot, an automatic way to represent themselves and their rights and their permissions, and data sources and data using services have to respect that. So in a sense, what it means is what Mehdi just described, is that you can have your MyData operator and tell the data source, I want this data to be accessed by this using service, and the data source has to respect it. That's in a sense in the governance and theoretical level. On the practical level, how that is enforced is that they fund data spaces, and for instance, they fund a health data space with a lot of money, saying that we will connect through a same infrastructure and same standards all hospitals, applications, medical providers, etc. And this space creates a lot of value for every kind of service. And so everybody that is in health space needs and wants to plug into it. And if you want to plug into it, you need to respect these rules. For instance, API neutrality, but also the fact that people can have their independent representation and tell you, share my data to that using service, without you being able to prioritize some data sharing over others. But the way to achieve that is, of course, through a top-down kind of regulation, as Mehdi said, and as is being enforced in Europe, but also through a business driver, as I was saying, to say that let's find the use cases and the value in each sector where organizations want to share data and invest in that. And there will be then cables for data sharing being built based on consent, etc. And then those same cables that we invested on and that people plugged into for business reasons are used to enforce the law, and then to be able for people to automatically share data to whatever their service. But in order to achieve that in the long way, the regulation-only approach is not sufficient. You need to have the business approach, because Mehdi was quoting the PSD2 initiative for banks. The thing is that today it's not very effective. Why? Because it was enforced top down to say, okay, to banks, you need to provide your data to any kind of service payment provider without any value, business value for the banks to do that. And it was also left in charge and at the costs of the banks to implement that. And so you end up with bad APIs. Even though it's the law, you end up with things that don't really provide quality data. So the way to tackle that is through, of course, a regulation that makes it mandatory. And you were asking about interoperability, and you can very much say that for a public procurement or whatever, you mandate interoperability, so you can have a top-down thing, but you need to think about the business driver in each sector for organizations to plug in. And they will plug in and make the investments if the data sharing has direct value. But then these cables that are built are the same ones that are used by people to share data with whatever the source, thanks to their individual rights. So it's both these approaches that make this network happen and sustainable.
Thank you, Matthias. Just one quick follow-up question. When you say value to the data sources, is that necessarily another form of data or information that goes back to them as they send data out, or is there some other sort of value that could be given?
There can be several ways. It can be very simply being able to monetize your data. Okay, I'm on the network, and I have spent so many years maintaining my database, and if you use it, to provide or to sell a service, I can ask for some money back. It can be to share, of course, some data on the data use, okay, and to have some data back on the usage, or it can be any sort of other exchange. But it's according to the type of service. If we take, for example, an employer, right? An employer has data about the skills of his employees. They don't want other employers to have access to that data, for instance, because it's sensitive strategic data. But they do want training organizations or universities to have access to that data, to provide the right trainings to their employees, and so that people stay kind of up to date with the skills needed in the industry. So that kind of data exchange they will share, and the value they get back is directly strategic for them. My people will be trained at the right level at the right time. But this way of sharing data, this cable to share data from the university from the employer to the university, is the same that will be used then by the individual with the rights to share from this employer to their next employer. And the way you mandate that to the employer is to say, if you want to be part of that network that will share data towards the university, you cannot not allow it to be shared to somebody else. And in the end, the trade-off is such that they accept it, because if somebody else is doing it, they are losing if they are not in this data network. And so they need to go there, even though some things happen that they don't want. If I look at also Adrian's comments, as he's saying, of course, they have created confusions of design things so that it's not interoperable and not to be shared. First of all, you need to provide incentives for these organizations to be able to share data. That's the first thing. And then, yes, the infrastructure and the standards should be defined at a more common level through a shared governance, not only the data sources, but everybody, the data sources, the using service, the government, that comes together to say, okay, these are the rules, and everybody applies them, like a parliament for the data space. And then everybody applies it, and if you don't want to apply it, then you cannot share data, and you don't share data, you're out of business today. So that's a bit the logic.
Matthias, that was really great. I think, yeah, I absolutely agree with everything you said. I want to have I want to hear from Kiran, um, uh, who wanted to ask about value, I believe. Kiran, are you there? Would you like to speak?
Yes. Hi. My question was just to understand how Korea looks at the value exchange. Like Matthias was mentioning, is there going to be monetization? And if there is some kind of monetization, how is the value decided?
Okay, great. So I think there's kind of two different aspects to that, because the industry that's most highly regulated right now is the financial services, the finance industry. And the way that they have structured it is so that these MyData businesses are essentially MyData operators. So if you if you don't have a license for a MyData business, then it's illegal for you to consolidate an individual's financial information and present it to him. Right. So I mean, another way to look at it is, if you are going to have a complete picture of a individual's personal finance, then you need to get licensed and you need to be vetted. And so what the MyData business is able to do with the license is it's able to provide that sort of financial information consolidation. Now, that's the main type of business that they can do. Now, on top of that, what they can do is they can, I'm sorry, so that's the main business that they have to do, right? The consolidation part. And on top of that, what they can do is they can do robo advisory services, right? So I think this is kind of like AI-based investment recommendations or advisory services. And a lot of the applicants, at least to my understanding, is that they are looking to do some sort of a personal finance management service. And I think the personal finance management service is pretty much common throughout all of the applicants. Um, uh, and then the other type of business that they can do is it's called information accounts, if I translate it word for word. But to me, the way I understand it, I think it's pretty much like having a PDS for your financial information. Um, and I think so that's kind of the different types of businesses that they can do. Like, one of the requirements in order to get certified is you need to present a business model to the FSC that is feasible. It doesn't have to make money like right away, like in a year or two, but it needs to be something that is feasible, and that clearly puts the individual that clearly benefits the individual. Now, the sort of the expression that the Financial Services Commission used to describe their idea of the MyData business, they used the word guardian angel of citizens, right? So if you're, for instance, in a business where you are hunting down people for defaulting on their loans, then you can't. There's no way you're going to get you're going to get licensed, right? So there's that. The whole point of the entire law is to protect the people, and how they're going to be making money is still kind of it's still up for grabs. It's not really clear yet. Most of the banks that have applied for it are doing so out of fear of losing their customers. So yeah, that's the extent to which I know. Kiran, if you want, then please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'd be happy to talk more about this and see if I can find out anything more for you. I want to I mean, I want to give the stage to Adrian because he's been waiting for a while. But before I do, Kiran, did that kind of answer your question, or do you have anything
Yeah,
else that you might want to mention?
to a point, I think I'm getting a bit of an understanding around value, and I'm keen to listen to what Adrian has to say on this matter as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Yeah. Adrian would have some great insights, I believe. Adrian,
Yes. So
yes, please. Thank you.
I put my comment about value in the chat. That's not the follow-up question that I was going to ask of the group. Again, hoping to hear both the Korean as well as sort of the MyData or the operator's perspective. And I think Matthias is probably going to be the first one to want to tackle this. It's my impression that in this API neutrality or the operator definition role that we've been talking about, another important distinction as we design these things technically and regulatory as well, is the difference between multi-use transactions, such as a skill or a driver's license, where one access of the API of the source is going to be used thousands of times potentially by different services. And transactions that are basically one-time use, like for instance, a credit score check that is really obsolete the instant it's rendered. And so I am curious, again, in terms of both the Korean regulatory context as well as the operator's evolution in MyData, do we separate out these two kinds of user experiences, if you want to think about it, or the relationship that the individual has with the consent mechanism or the permissioning system? And where do we go from there? In other words, who's going to do that work? Because in my experience, specifically working on these standards, for 5 or more years around the self-sovereign identity and authorization standards in, around OAuth, this is a very big distinction, a very big deal, this distinction.
Does anyone have something to say to that?
I'm not sure. It was kind of proposed that I answer, but I'm not sure I understood, Adrian. You mean that in the consent mechanism, you can have a very specific one for one time, and you can have more generic ones, like in general, I authorize my skills to be used to provide me training offers, and then everybody can use it.
Let me be clearer, because Kalia, again, if any of you were in the plenary session, one of the big challenges, the central challenges that Kalia made to what's going on in the India stack example that was the topic, was that the services always had to call home. In other words, there was a privacy or a control or a censorship potential, all of the above, in the way that India stack was set up. Now, in the self-sovereign identifiers and self-sovereign identity community, it is almost religion that there be no calling home. In other words, that the source should never know when a particular credential, like a driver's license, for example, was used. And that certainly works very well for something like a government-issued credential, like a driver's license. But it does not work for a lot of other services. Whether you think again about a credit report, or you think in terms of a health record inquiry. So we already talked about the problems of having a personal data store, where we agree completely. Matthias and I at least agree completely about that. And then, but I now want to sort of dig into, Chris mentioned, for instance, which parts of the government initiative, the K-Data initiative, are going, or not just Chris, but the people who are speaking are going in the direction of SSI. And so what I'm pointing out is that the SSI people are really focused on the skills use case rather than the credit bureau use case. And in reality, both cross-border and within a single country, those have to be dealt with differently. And they're equally important.
Matthias and Adrian, Adrian and I, we have another session on Saturday, and I think Matthias, if you could come to that session, it would be a really great place to continue this, to discussing this, and I would really like to do that. I'll send you the invite. It's called Self-Sovereign Agents. I want to show the last video that we have prepared. It's a 5-minute video. It describes what K-Data does and the way that they do it, and how they are facilitating this MyData ecosystem in Korea. I think as we finish the video, it will probably run out of time. So before I start playing it, I want to also mention that so Scylla has asked me to, before I close the session, please guide people back again to KikoChat to leave your main takeaways and learnings from this session in the Share Highlights tab. This will also be used for extracting the main learnings of the whole program content. Yes, so if you could do that, then that would be really great, very much appreciated. This is the first session of the conference, and I feel like it's so much fun already. I really look forward to meeting all of you again in the other sessions, and I hope we can continue.
And
I'm
Chris,
going to play the video. Yes.
sorry, Chris, just 20 seconds. Sorry to jump in, but since it was also to think about cross-border cooperation, this session, I'd like to say that we see here there are lots of rules, like Adrian just mentioned, that have to be decided regarding this data access, and that it can not only be in the hands of some data sources or some data using services. It needs to be a common effort. From Europe, but we have ties with Ghana, with the US, sometimes with Japan. We are working inside a new governance to create this kind of roundtables to discuss those rules. And again, congratulations on all the work that has been happening. And it will be great to also unite with what you're doing in Korea to discuss those rules together, because it needs to be a global effort on this infrastructure. So there are no clear answers to everything, but there's a clear solution, is that we need to band together and discuss them together through a shared and open governance. And this is what we'd like to propose as well to K-Data, and congratulations again, and sorry for jumping in.
No, not at all. Yeah, I think the feeling is mutual. I know K-Data is here today because they want to work across borders. And definitely we will we'll continue our dialogue. And also not just people in Europe, but anywhere in the world. If you feel like the way I feel, where your country may be not as active in the international community as you would want them to be, then I think it's one person starting is better than none, right? So yeah, with that being said, thank you, Matthias. I know we'll be meeting again very soon. So great. There's a link shared as well. Okay, I'm gonna play the video, and yeah, and then I guess we'll end the session. Thank you all for coming here. This is actually a really great video. It shows the ways that the Korea Data Agency is tackling the ecosystem issue from many different aspects. So I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, my name is Mili, and I'm going to talk about what we do as the MyData team at KData. As you saw earlier, there are 4 government branches that are driving MyData in Korea. KData is a sub-branch of the Ministry of Science and Ict, and the MyData team is a department of KData. The MyData team has 4 core activities: surveys, research, consulting, and project funding. We conduct surveys to understand what the general public wants. For example, here you can see the results for one of our surveys. That was about finding out what the public think is most important in order to trust an organization that wants to process their personal data. The top 5 conditions were security, accountability in case of a data breach, conforming to regulations, having an easy-to-read privacy policy, and personalized services. Here's another example of a survey on the expected roles of government. Law and policy making is clearly the most important role that the public expects. Second is the provisioning of standards. There are also high expectations for government agencies to educate the public about managing personal data, developing certification programs, as well as providing governance and business support. Our research efforts are mainly focused on understanding global trends better and modifying our approach as needed. As an example, in 2019, this was how we imagined the roles of actors in the MyData ecosystem. Our research showed that this model was more aligned with MyData. Once we understood how to modify our approach, we incorporated this model in our 2020 project funding by making it a requirement. Another key activity of ours is providing free consulting services for startups that want to enter the personal data market. Quite often, these new entrants are focused on innovative services or technologies. Sometimes it is easy for them to overlook some of the core principles for handling personal data. Our consulting efforts allow these companies to focus more on what they do best while ensuring that they will not encounter unexpected obstacles. We try to make sure that they hit the ground running so that the collective impact of these innovative startups can add to the momentum of MyData adoption in Korea. Finally, since last year, we have been providing funding for pilot projects. In 2019, we funded 8 consortiums in their pilot projects. 3 were healthcare related, 2 were about commerce, and we had 1 each for energy consortium, finance, and skills data for academic researchers. In 2020, our funding went to 2 healthcare projects, 2 finance, 2 mobility, and 1 each for lifestyle, commerce, and public welfare. As I mentioned earlier, our research influenced our requirements for project funding between 2019 and 20. Part of the reason we are here today is to understand better how to modify our selection criteria for the project we will be funding in 2021. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, so what you just saw was what KData does. They do surveys to understand what the public needs. They do research to make sure that they're doing things in the best way possible. They provide consulting for free to startups so that these startups would have the competitive edge that they need, or at least to ensure that they don't run into any unexpected troubles that they could have easily avoided. And finally, there is the project funding. And the project funding is always it's about how to select who to fund. And I think that's a question that's always on the mind of KData. So if you have any suggestions, advice, questions, then please feel free to email Mr. or Director Kim at bkkim@kdata.or.kr. I'm going to write it in the chat one more time, or.kr. Or you can email me at chris.lee@mydata.org. And yeah, this is great. I think we're going to get Korea on the map in the world, do great things. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Chris.